This is Wilson's words from his long-lost essay about Crowley, Do What Thou Wilt. And this is starting on page 22. And I'm just going to read for a little bit, man, you know? So this is called, he calls this section, A Crowleyan Curriculum. We know that Aleister Crowley obtained admission to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in 1898 at the age of 23, and that he was invited to accept the 6th degree of the Ordo Templi Orientis in 1910 at the age of 35. The third of the magical societies connected with his name, the AA, is more mysterious. We do not even know what the initials stand for. Some say Atlantean Adepts, but others claim Argentum Astrum, Silver Star. We don't know when he joined it or if he joined it. For some authorities believe it never existed, safe as one of the notorious Crowley hoaxes. Nevertheless, people who are findable, who are initiated into the AA by Crowley, Miss Jane Wolfe of England for one, and the curriculum of the AA has been published as an appendix to Crowley's Magic and Theory and Practice. This gives us a handy guide to the kind of education Crowley thought appropriate for the scientific illuminist. It consists of 13 steps. 1. The student must read a fairly lengthy corpus of literature consisting of A. Various classics of mysticism and magic, the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, work of Blavatsky, Molinos, Pythagoras, etc. B. General philosophy, Hume, Berkeley, Erdmann's History of Philosophy, etc. C. Rationalist and anti-religious classics, Tom Paine, Huxley, etc. D. Studies in comparative religion, Fraser's Golden Bow, Wright's Worship of Priapus, etc. E. Fantasy and science fiction to stretch the mind, Hinton's Flatland, Carroll's Alice books, Dracula, etc. F. All of Crowley's own writing. Of course, right? What's the point of starting a school if you can't get the students to read your own books? How many people ever took college classes and most of the books on the syllabus are written by the professor? That's cool, though. I mean, if it's a cool class, right? The probationer, after being tested in knowledge of the above classics, is allowed to practice any form of magic or yoga he likes for 1 year and must keep a careful record of each experiment in its results. 3. The neophyte is then assigned to attain mystery of astral projection and is not promoted again until this is accomplished. So he's going through the steps. All right. Word up. All right, so full disclosure, I've made some weed butter, and it's really strong, and I've been putting it into my coffee all day, and I'm a little fucked up right now. All right, so 4, the zealator must achieve complete technical proficiency in yogic postures, asanas, and yogic breath control, pranayama. 5. The practicus must study the Kabbalah and learn to classify magical and mystical states on the diagram known as the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. 6. The philosophus is put through certain moral tests which have never been published and are possibly not even known as tests when the subject is plunged into them. Word up. 7. The dominus liminis is trained in yogic concentration and control over the mind. 8. The adeptus minor is trained in sexual yoga. 9. The adeptus major is taught all the secrets of practical magic. 10. The adeptus exemptus confronts a further test which determines future advancement. 11. The magister templi becomes a teacher of the lower grades. 12. The magus is able to teach a new level of consciousness to mankind. The magi of the past were Lao Tzu, Buddha, Krishna, Thoth, Moses, Muhammad, and Idam Vaishap, a Grand Master of the Masonic Order of the Illuminati. 13. The ipsissimus cannot be defined. He is, quote, beyond all comprehension of those of lower degree. How about that shit? All right, so those are the 13 stages and of initiation, I suppose, into Crowley's system of AA, which Wilson was completely fascinated by at this time in the 70s when he was writing, and a lot of his inspiration came from the work of Kenneth Grant when discussing Crowley, but also, probably more importantly in many ways, the work of Israel Regardie and his time, Wilson's time hanging out with Grady McMurtry, who was, the Grand Master of the OTO at that time, in the 70s. All right, so we continue. It appears that Crowley did not follow this system rigidly in all cases. According to John Simon's The Great Beast, when a certain Hollywood actress arrived at Crowley's Abbey of Thelema in Sicily in 1920, she was first induced to smoke opium for a day and a night, then taken to an isolated hut and ordered to master the techniques of asana and pranayama before returning to mingle with the other students or consult with the master again. Israel Regardie, in Rockaway the Stone, describes the kind of training Crowley used with his Paris students in the later 1920s. It is closer to the above curriculum. Quote, the first responsibility set for the beginner was to do some reading from a preliminary list. When he had completed this mass of reading in some 3 months, he could apply for a written examination of the study material. The prime intention here was to ensure that he had, at the very least, acquired an intellectual familiarity. Let's try that again. An intellectual familiarity with basic classical material. Before him lay a year's arduous work of practical experimental level. He had personally to select from the assorted materials he had read a particular practice or several practices, meditation or magical or devotional. It was up to his own discretion and ingenuity. Nobody could tell him what to select or what to do. Mandatory, however, was keeping a magical record, a diary. Whatever else he might slipshod in, the diary had to be entered regularly and soberly and in detail. To fail in this was inexcusable. At the end of a whole year's work, the record was to be submitted to Crowley for examination. Since Crowley, borrowing from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, had written that, quote, equilibrium is the basis of the work, unquote. He then prescribed specific exercises and practices that would tend to equilibrate the student's psychological structure. Had the student chosen to work with yoga alone, Crowley might recommend some diametrically opposed practices, such as devotional exercises, ceremonial magic, or whatnot. The effect of this was to prevent the student developing one-sided traits of character. In the event that the student showed promise and was theoretically familiar with, say, William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, Crowley might recommend the use of hashish. I want to emphasize unequivocally that Crowley has asserted not once but 1,000 times that the discipline itself was far more important than one particular result or attainment, unquote. And that was from Israel Regardie. In Magick Without Tears, letters written to a pupil who could not meet with him regularly during the war years, 1943 to 45, and Crowley then being in his late 60s, we find another variation on the curriculum. The student, Miss Wolfe, is first assigned 6-month study in Kabbalism. While this progresses, Crowley writes to her weekly, encouraging skepticism and critical analysis of all she reads. Later, she is taught astral projection, the elements of magical invocation, and finally, the 6 techniques of yoga: asana, pranayama, dharana, pratyahara, yama, and niyama. He insists again and again on scientific accuracy in records kept and is merciless in criticizing the usual language of mysticism. This is from the Crowley book. Quote, "Whatever you mean by God conveys no idea to me. I can only guess by the light of my exceedingly small knowledge of you and your general habits of thought and action. Then what sense was there in chucking it at my head? Half a brick would have served you better. I know I'm not a disheartening kind of bloke, and surely what was said was perfectly harmless. And no, not harmless at all. My whole object is to train you to silence every kind of hypothetical speculation and formula resonant and satisfying. I want you to abhor them, abominate them, despise them, eschew them, hate them, loathe them, and da capo, and to get on with your practice." In De Arte Magica, an instruction manual in sexual yoga for the Ordo Templi Orientis, Crowley writes that the, quote, "knight monk on the order should remember among, quote, treasures to be preserved, the history of the order, including its persecution by the Catholic Church, and, quote, our war on those never wholly subdued foes of humanity, tyranny, and superstition," unquote. It may be said that Aleister Crowley's goal in life was to deliver the arts of mysticism from dogmatists, fanatics, theologians, and fools, making them available to persons of logical and scientific mind, says Wilson. Humor and truth. My conversion to my own religion may yet take place. That's from Crowley's Equinox of the Gods, published in 1936. In Crowley's delightful short story, Great Tao, a Chinese Taoist magician lands on the shore of Japan during a period of chaos and decay, greeting the inhabitants with the following cheerful song: "Blow the tom-tom, bang the flute, let us all be merry. I'm a party with a cute chronic berry. Monday, I'm a skinny critter, quite fleekin' ropesy. Blow the cymbal, bang the zither. Tuesday, I have dropsy. Wednesday, cardiac symptoms come. Thursday, diabetic. Blow the fiddle, strum the drum. Friday, I'm paratetic. If on Saturday my foes join in legions serried, then on Sunday I suppose I'll be buried. A little play on words. Quite poetic. A correspondence between this remarkable fellow and the Mikado soon ensues. By telegraph, highlights are from the Mikado, quote, "Who is your honorable self, And why has your excellency paid us cattle the distinguished compliment of a visit? Answer, quote, this disgusting worm is great Tao. I humbly beg your sublime radiance to trample his slave, unquote. The Mikado, regret great Tao unintelligible. Answer, great Tao, T-A-O, Tao. Mikado, what is great Tao? Answer, the result of subtracting the universe from itself. Eventually, it is arranged for great Tao to visit the imperial palace, and after a great deal of politeness and decorum, serious conversation begins. Great Tao finally delivers his cure for all social problems in the following terms, charmingly echoing Lao Tzu in places and in others following the Golden Dawn principles of equilibrium, but withal characteristically Crowleyite emphasis on Anton. To the prostitute I prescribe a course of training by which she shall comprehend the holiness of sex. Chastity forms part of that training. To the prude I equally prescribe a course of training by which she shall comprehend the holiness of sex. Unchastity forms part of that training. To the bigot I commend a course of Thomas Henry Huxley, to the infidel a practice study of ceremonial magic. Thus, when the bigot has knowledge and the infidel faith, each may follow without the prejudice his natural inclination, for he will no longer plunge into his former excesses. I have been taxed with assaulting what is commonly known as virtue. True, I hate it, but only in the same degree as I hate what is commonly known as vice. There are men who make a fetish of cleanliness. They shall work in a fitter's shop and learn that dirt is the mark of honorable toil. There are those whose lives are rendered wretched by the fear of infection. Such would I send to live in the bazaar of Delhi. There are slow men who need a few months' experience of the hustle of the stockyards. There are businessmen in a hurry, and they shall travel in Central Asia to acquire the art of repose. By solitude and fasting for the social and luxurious, by drunkenness and debauch for the austere, by scourging for those afraid of physical pain, by repose for the restless and toil for the idle, by bullfights for the humanitarian, and the care of little children for the callous, by rituals for the rational, and by philosophy for the credulous, shall men seek to attain the unity with the great Tao. Right on. For those familiar with the book and the movie Fight Club, that's Aleister Crowley was the original Tyler Durden. That's interesting, right? That sort of polarity training. Okay. Continuing on. Page 27 from Robert Anton Wilson's long lost, now found essay, Do What Thou Wilt, about Aleister Crowley. Those who have, by these methods, attained to relative equilibrium shall be admitted to a special training body for further advancement in wisdom. This body shall be called Synagogue of Satan, to avoid attracting, quote, the fools who mistake names for things, unquote. By intellectual and spiritual influence, this group shall be, quote, master of all, unquote. But it shall, quote, never seek to dominate, unquote. The Mikado is so delighted by this program that it is instituted at once with such happy results that thereafter, quote, no less than 365 days in every year, one extra day every fourth year, quote, unquote, are set aside for special rejoicing. We find no problem here. Crowley is obviously saying what many mystics have said before him, and his lightly humorous touch is hardly without precedent. Recall the absurdities of Zhangzhou, the riddles of the Zen masters, the jokes of the Sufi saint Mullah Nasruddin. Our perplexity arises when we find that in a work as mystical and pious as his Ambrosi Magi Hortus Rosarium, the marginal notes are not quite as classical as they seem. Quote, Pater ibit scientum scribe, unquote, for instance, is a notaricon and yields a startling comment when one scans the first letter of each word in turn. The same is true for, quote, culpa urbium nota terri, unquote, and many other marginalia in this book and in other of his holy works. This has left some readers mildly aghast. Yeah, I wonder why. Then there is the Book of Lies, which has baffled more readers than any mystical text since the Tao Te Ching. Things are not helped by the subtitle, quote, which is also falsely called Breaks, the wanderings and falsifications of the one thought of Frater Perdurabu, which thought is itself untrue, unquote. Yeah, that's the subtitle. Trying to reason one's way around in this formula is 2 degrees more oxymoronic than Empedocles' paradox of the liar who asserts that he lies, or Bertrand Russell's problem of the barber who shaves all the men who do not shave themselves. Does he shave himself? Chapter 69 of this remarkable work, How to Succeed and How to Suck Eggs, appears to be about the miracle of Pentecost, called, quote, the gift of tongues by Catholics. It is actually about Orogentilism, and both the title and chapter number are bawdy puns. The way to succeed, well, how to succeed, and how to suck eggs. That's some like mystical porno right there. There is a curious note on the title page of this volume, incidentally informing us helpfully that, quote, there is no joke or subtle meaning in the publisher's imprint, unquote. This seems only a veiled warning about the rest of the text, but Francis King has recently discovered that the imprint is actually misdated 1 year, making the warning the only real lie in the Book of Lies. Could there possibly be any point in such relentlessly intricate pranks on the reader? There is also the puzzling matter of the Bagimoter, quote, the scented garden, which was published as a newly discovered Persian manuscript of the Middle Ages. It now appears that the original never existed. The translator, a British major who died gallantly in the Boer War, he never seems aware of the homosexual meaning of many verses he renders, also never existed, and the bishop who wrote the introduction was imaginary. Aleister Crowley concocted the whole of waffle, but not out of whole cloth. Many similar texts using homosexual love as syndoche of the divine rapture were composed by Sufi poets of the Persian Middle Ages. Did Crowley devise this prank as a subliminal propaganda for gay liberation, as a nuisance to contemporary English Sufis who prefer to ignore that part of their tradition, or just because he felt like writing some poetry in the Persian manner? Or was there more? It has been calculated that the Kabbalistic value of the letters in Bag-e-Mauter add to 1906, the year Crowley achieved Samadhi. His codes are endless, as are his numerology games. The Confessions has 96 chapters, 3 in third person, evidently representing the 3 non-ego states on the Kabbalistic tree of life. The rest of the book then is 93 chapters, and 93 is the basic magic number in his system. Similarly, Layla, heroine of the Book of Lies, is homonic for Layla Waddle, his mistress at the time, but is also Arabic for night. Anuit, his goddess, means night in French. The gruesome chapter in Magic, in Theory and Practice, called Of Blood Sacrifice and Matters, of blood sacrifice, is not about killing animals, as it appears to be, but about sexual intercourse during the woman's menstrual period, which Crowley, like the alchemists, considered energetically beneficial to magic workings. Elsewhere, he described it under the traditional alchemical code, quote, making red into gold, unquote. That this is chapter 13 is no accident. Evidently, the moon menstrual cycle. It is also no accident that the chapter in the Confessions, and that was Crowley's autobiography, which he called an auto-hagiography. In the chapter in the Confessions where he hints at the letters of the Masonic word happens to be chapter 72. See the back of your dollar bill. Boom, there you go. He's dropping knowledge. Yoga for Yahoos was originally published by Mahatma Guru Prahanasa Zavaji, a name roughly equivalent to Lord Master Great God Little Devil. Guess the real author. Hint, his initials were AC. Hail Mary was published anonymously and widely praised in Roman Catholic publications before Crowley revealed he was its author and what some of the verses were originally dedicated to Isis. White Stains, his most decadent volume, the very title, A Handful of Guck in the Face of Victorian Prudery, was signed George Archibald. This appears to be the name of a pious uncle our anti-hero particularly detested. But at this point, we might consider his warning in Liber Alph, the Book of Wisdom and Folly, quote, Yea, I, thy father, work for thee solicitously, and also I laugh at the perplexities, for so it was foreordained that I should do so. Also, it is thy nature as it is mine, O my son, to will that all men share our mirth and jollity. Wherefore have I proclaimed my law to man, and thou continuest in that work of joyance. In fact, it is no accident that magicians and witches are usually portrayed in popular art as laughing wildly and a bit crazily. From the perspective of the higher consciousness states, the world is not a problem to be solved, but a joke to be enjoyed and even enriched. The fact that Crowley's humor has often been used as evidence against him, quote, to prove, unquote, that he was a black magician, a blasphemer, or a Satanist, merely shows that those making such accusations have never achieved an expanded awakening themselves. Such folk should remember that Scotus Origina listed hilaritas as a symptom of the spiritual consciousness, as did that model of Roman Catholic sobriety. St. Thomas Aquinas. Indeed, after his awakening, which occurred in the last week of his life, Thomas said that his sober and earnest theological writings seemed to him weeds. Perhaps if he had lived longer and written from this post-awakened state, the bulldog of Aquinine might have left us a final testament as absurd, as paradoxical, and even as obscene. The Tao is in dung, as Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, or even as mind-bending as the Book of Lies. So this section's called Projections, Astral and Half Astral. If the dogmatic old-fashioned Christian is somewhat unconvinced by the above apology for absurdity, the dogmatic old-fashioned materialist is still more dubious about the need to balance logical empiricism with yogic and magic disciplines. For instance, what the deuce was Aleister Crowley doing when he projected his astral body outside his physical body and taught his pupils to do the same? Aren't such practices delusory and possibly dangerous? Well, in fact, the description of astral projection as delusory and dangerous does not come from any scientific criticism of magic, but from Aleister Crowley himself. His essay, The Psychology of Hashish, where he quickly adds that although this is true of astral projection, it is not true of the higher mystical trances of dhyana and samadhi. This should not bother the prospective magician in the slightest. His desire to collect data and our subjective experiences are all data, however we interpret them after the event. The practice itself is simple and most entertaining. The apprentice merely sits in a comfortable position or yogic position if he knows that he can hold that comfortably, with his spine erect in an empty room where he is not likely to be disturbed. With eyes closed, he visualizes his astral body sitting in an astral chair facing him. When this is visualized with perfect clarity and distinctness, consciousness is moved out of the physical body into the astral body. So, go in the room, turn out the lights, close your eyes, use your imagination to create a form in front of you. Yourself, looking at yourself, and then you fill that self with as much of yourself as possible. Some people find this step difficult. The drugs used by Crowley and other magicians, hashish, ether, particularly make it much easier. When awareness is centered in the astral body, one opens the astral eyes and enjoys the sensation of looking at one's own physical body from outside. This is always an emotional experience to the beginner. After one has enjoyed and analyzed this unique experience, one begins rising on the planes, ascending the 32 levels of the astral world and exploring them. They are quite a bit livelier and more colorful than the dense material world of ordinary consciousness. The Master Therion has been at some pains to write a tightly compressed little book, Liber 777, which is an anatomy in convenient table form of all 32 astral planes, their scenery, their typical denizens, their associated perfumes, astrological signs, alchemical equivalents, etc. Guided by this book and some studies in comparative religions, as Fraser's Golden Bow or Joseph Campbell's Masks of God, the astral voyager can easily determine where he has been, who has been there before him, and what major religions or philosophies or even scientific models have been formed by other voyagers who remembered visions of these arcane places. There is no absolute need to posit any supernatural theories at all about these investigations. One can say that one has been exploring around Carl Jung's collective unconscious, which is quite respectably scientific. or one can assume that the whole adventure is an entry into molecular consciousness, the visual aspect of DNA memory of the species, which is Dr. Timothy Leary's theory about LSD voyages, and might equally describe these astral trips. Or one can, if so inclined, take the opposite tact and dare to believe that one has been deciphering the Akashic records of the theosophical hypothesis, or tuning into the astral switchboard suggested by the young American magician P.E.I. Bonwitz, which sounds both traditionally mystical and quite electronically modern. The real interest lies not in such interpretations, but in the actual visions themselves, especially as one acquires greater experience and more control. The most intriguing experiences to those of scientific training and skeptical intellect occur not on the astral plane, but between there and here. These are not normally visible to the eyes of the physical body. Here it seems indeed that one is veritably projected in astral consciousness across real physical space. These are by no means rare experiences. There is much reason to think that we hear so little of them because people keep silent about them, thinking they might be diagnosed as crazy. Nevertheless, they occur to many people who are not even attempting to perform astral projection. And the English psychologist Celia Green has written a whole book painstakingly analyzing 400 such cases called Out-of-Body Experiences. It was published by Baltine Press in 1968 by Celia Green. It is by no means easy to explain all these accounts as autosuggestion or hallucination. Similarly, the very astute Dr. John Lilly, in his Center of the Cyclone, describes 2 incidents in which he seemingly projected himself from a laboratory in Kansas City, where he engaged in hypnosis research, to a friend's home in California. Subsequent checking revealed that the events he saw, quote unquote, were actually occurring there at the time of his, quote unquote, visit. All such events can be analyzed by Occam's razor into real telepathy, ESP, combined with the hallucination of astral travel. This is a more economical explanation than that of astral projection itself. Whether it can be maintained as research proceeds is something that remains to be seen. Crowley himself often projected successfully to the home of a friend in Hong Kong, but although they agreed on what transpired while his astral body was there, he utterly failed in producing concrete physical phenomena. For instance, his attempts to knock a vase off. The English magician David Conway reminds us in his Magick, an Occult Primer, quote, "The mechanics of this astral awareness are best explained if we think of the mind as a mirror in which images are reflected. Most of these images are due to the reaction of one or more of our sense organs, but it is still the mind that does most of the work. This is what Aristotle meant when he declared that the words 'I see' really mean 'I have seen.' For the mind has in this case intervened to sort out whatever impressions were made on the optic nerve. Because of this, the mind can be described as the surface on which is reflected the reality known to us by experience. Like the celebrated Lady of Shalott, we behold the outside world in a looking glass like Tennyson's heroine. We need only to change the angle of the glass for it to reflect new and hear the thereto unsuspected things. Thus, no one is naive enough nowadays to believe that lions, snakes, and knights in armor populate the astral planes. We see such things because our subconscious has translated the non-pictorial impressions it has received directly into objective forms recognizable by the mind. Reference back to the structural differential should make this point more clear to any who find it obscure. It applies, we must remember, both to astral perception and to the normal perception we take so much for granted. As Crowley remarks in Magick in Theory and Practice, in the astral light, we are bound by what is superficially an entirely different series of laws. Our operations in that light are really the adventures of our own personified thoughts. The universe is a projection of ourselves, an image as unreal as that of our faces in a mirror. Yet, like that face, the necessary form of expression thereof, not to be altered save we alter ourselves. This passage must not be understood as asserting that the universe is purely subjective. On the contrary, the magical theory accepts the absolute reality of all things in the most objective sense, but all perceptions are neither the observer nor the observed. They are representatives of the relation between them. We have known since Newton that was true of optics. Albert Einstein proved it was true of all dynamic physical systems. The theory of magic merely generalizes it to all systems, dynamic or static, physical or otherwise. In this philosophical position, it is no more subjective than the transactional psychology of Alfred Ames, the Gestalt neuropsychology of Kohler, the general semantics of Korzybski, the mathematical biology of Rajewski and Rappaport, or the synergetic cosmology of R. Buckminster Fuller. Page 34, Masks of God. Another method of Crowleyan magic seems less impossible to the rationalist than astral projection, but appears absurd to all philosophies until they have given it a suitable trial. This is the, quote, assumption of God forms, unquote. Like astral projection, this exercise also begins as an act of imagination, but there is no reason at all to think it would ever becomes anything else. Its value lies in forcing our awareness to the discovery that those things which appear most real to us are also acts of imagination. This is the experimental procedure. The student or dupe merely sits with spine erect in posture that is comfortable to him or her. It is necessary to have a room where one will not be interrupted. While sitting in this erect, alert posture, one begins by closing the eyes and carefully envisioning one's body changing until it has become a deity. Thoth of the ibis head, patron of magic, is a good god to use here, since his physical form is especially easy to memorize and visualize. One holds onto this visualization for quite a long time, until it is fully three-dimensional, clear in all details, crisp as a Renaissance portrait. Then one begins to expand the image. One is not merely a god form, but gradually a god size, bigger than one's house, bigger than the city, bigger than the planet Earth, bigger than the solar system. One can continue outward to galactic dimensions, actually or even beyond. One holds this cosmic view as long as possible and then returns to normal consciousness, back in the room and the skin one left so dramatically a while ago. ESP, race memory, a kind of ecological or planetary consciousness, and even solar or stellar consciousness are sometimes keyed off by this exercise when it is performed enough and with vivid imagination. What are these alternative levels of consciousness? This is a question we do not need to ask at this point, presumably. Each experimenter will invent his or her own theory in line with whatever kind of experience is gained in this visualization and trance. Here we are, of course, a rather dramatic alternative to the well-known yogic exercise of visualizing a geometrical form, say a triangle. Until one has successfully vanquished all other internal processes, verbal and visual. When successful, this triggers off dhyana, the state Crowley achieved in 1902, in which the observer and the observed are one. Both of these exercises are made easier by the preliminary ingestion of small amounts of hashish and marijuana. So you heard that, man? Get your lighters up. It is well recognized by psychiatrists and psychologists of all schools that one of the primary problems of civilized humanity is negative self-image. This is enforced on all members of the servile classes and lower members of the ruling class in all authoritarian cultures. In order to ensure that they will obey the tribal rules and take orders from above. Dr. Albert Ellis, the master of Fort Wright vernacular, calls it the sense of poor itty-bitty shitty me. It emphatically includes, in almost all cases, negative body image. Psychologists are continually amazed at how many handsome and attractive men and women believe firmly that there's something unspeakably ugly about their nude bodies. The reader had better look back at the structural differential one more time. The reader had better look at the structural differential one more time. Otherwise, he is in danger of, quote, understanding without really knowing what is said. The negative self-image, including the negative body image, are on the verbal levels and only partially on the objective visual level. Metaphorically, they are soundtracks and movie films projected inside our minds. So here you go. Wilson is basically saying don't body shame, in 1974, in his 1974 transcript, right? No body shaming. It's about the experience, right? Other than beyond the look, because beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's about experiencing life, right? Word. So we continue. Dr. Eric Byrne includes them in what he calls our life scripts. They're absolutely subjective. Our partial and very limited awareness that the soundtrack internal monologue is subjective, and our total unawareness that the movie film visual field is subjective, are two major hallucinations causing the, quote, normal insanity of everyday human society. It's a good way to put it. This is what Gurdjieff and Buddha meant in saying we are all sleepwalkers. This is what mystical awakening is, awakening from. Recognition that all this is me is the dhyana state sought by yoga and high magic. All this is me. Woof. Almost sounds like magical narcissism though, right? Shit. But they're talking about something else entirely, right? Like dhyana, like the idea that like everything we're interpreting right now is being processed through a grid of ego identification. So even to describe anything, we're all part of like a certain system. Like it's a paradoxical understanding of self, right? Now it is easy to see this on the structural differential. Any study of optics or neurology brings it home to the understanding. Reading of the Upanishads or Heraclitus or Bohm or the scientific and witty modern mystic Alan Watts easily makes it clear to the unprejudiced mind. Such intellectual understanding is not enough to liberate anybody. What is needed is neurological understanding by the organism as a whole. And that is what the strange techniques of yoga and magic are largely for. We do not need new understanding, but new imprinting. He who can change easily from the thoth self-image to the normal little suffering me self-image and back again rapidly and repeatedly is beginning to awaken. He will have a dawning sense of what the Zen Buddhists mean in saying mind is, quote, no form, what the medieval Platonist Gemesto Plathon meant in saying mind is omniform, and how they both agree, authority and submission. St. Aleister himself offers the following explanation of the time he became Count Vladimir Sverov. Quote, I wanted to increase my knowledge of mankind. I knew how people treated a young man from Cambridge. I had thoroughly appreciated the servility of tradesmen, although I was too generous and ignorant to realize the extent of their dishonesty and rapacity. Now, I wanted to see how people would behave to a Russian nobleman. I must say that I have repeatedly used this method of disguise. It has been amazingly useful in multiplying my points of view about humanity. Even the most broad-minded people are necessarily narrow in this one respect. They may know how all sorts of people treat them, but they cannot know, except at second hand, how those same people treat others. So in that quote reveals one thing that fascinated Bob about Crowley, I think, and it was Crowley's multiplicity of identity, right? That he was this positive identityist, that he sought to constantly view the world through multiple identities, right? But what he does here, what this pastime that Crowley had apparently of getting into character, getting into costume, getting dressed up, and then treating the world like a stage and going out and acting, and the method, right? Like Jim Carrey on the set of the Andy Kaufman movie, where, quote, he never got out of character, right? So getting into character, so to speak, and going out into the world pretending you're someone else. You see Crowley's intention here, according to Wilson, is this desire to see things from a multiple angle, right? And that's super fascinating, and it makes sense why Wilson was interested in that, right? And that coincides with the times, the early 20th century. There is this birth of multiplicity of points of view, within the Western world, right? In the early 1900s, and then it's reflected in the art of, basically the discovery and application of the idea of the montage, right? Montage art. Film is born in the late 1800s, and soon after that, in the early 1900s, there are the Russian filmmakers who, create great works of montage art, right? And James Joyce is influenced by that, Sergei Eisenstein and those fellas, right? And as is Ezra Pound, and what they're creating are montages, with words, right? And this flickering movement of multiple layers of angles, of positions, of points of view that now the camera provides people like never before, like the written word didn't even provide before, in the way that it was laid out, right, grammatically, right? So then along comes, you got later on Cezanne and the birth of Cubism, which the painted image is able to somewhat reflect these multiple points of view, right? And then much later on comes someone like William Burroughs, who wanted to apply in a similar way what James Joyce applied to the written word, And this is one reason why Robert Anton Wilson loved the work of William Burroughs so much, was because he felt like Burroughs somewhat succeeded when he and Brian Geisen created the cut-up method, taking the written word in its narrative form, cutting it up and applying a random factor to it, like the quantum physicists of the day. Everyone's seeking to apply a random factor, right? And but all of this, how does it look? Like a montage, and I think illuminatus trilogy is a book of collection of montages, but what all this says is maybe our minds work more like a montage than how our art has reflected it. And now here is the great breakthrough, where we can see even deeper into ourselves, into the human functioning self, and gain deeper knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of this life that we have here, And Crowley got it a little bit from dressing up like a Russian nobleman and walking around, pretending he was some fucking Russian guy. We continue. Lack of this knowledge, of course, allows the ruling class in all authoritarian societies to go on believing that the servile class are quite happy and content in their lot. Crowley adds a more provocative thought in a later passage, also from the Confessions, dealing with this in his production of a whole book, Hail Mary, which seemed to be the poetic rhapsodies of a devout Roman Catholic. Quote, I must not be thought exactly insincere, though I had certainly no shadow of belief in any of the Christian dogmas. I simply wanted to see the world through the eyes of a devout Catholic, very much as I had done with the decadent poet of white stains, the Persian mystic, the Bag al-Matir, and so on. I did not see why I should be confined to one life. How can one hope to understand the world if one persists in regarding it from the conning tower of one's own personality? The same thought is taught differently by the 20th century's second internationally famous magus, Don Juan Matus, teacher of magic to anthropologist Carlos Castaneda. Says Don Juan in Journey to Ixtlan, quote, that is a little secret I am going to give you today. Nobody knows my personal history. Nobody knows who I am or what I do, not even I. How can I know who I am when I am all of this? Little by little, you must create a fog around you until nothing can be taken for granted, until nothing is any longer for sure or real. There you go. Well, Castaneda certainly created a fog around himself. So that's interesting. According to esoteric tradition, this is the inner meaning of the famous Sufi parable about the 5 blind men and the elephant. Each of us, like one of the blind men in the fable, sees only in part, through the lens of one narrow and seemingly rigid ego. When the ego expands to infinity, when the mind is both no form and all forms, when there is no longer a real or foreshore ego at the center of perception, the ears and tail and side and legs of the elephant all fall into relationship. One finally sees the elephant. In another sense, one is the elephant. When returned to normal, statistically normal consciousness, one may then be much inclined to babble of union with God, discovery of the true self, the Buddha mind of bliss at the center of everything, the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, etc. But if one retains enough perspective to recognize that both this glowing vision and normal consciousness are dramas staged by the same faculty of imaginative identification, one will gradually cease to babble at all. Faculty of imaginative identification. identification. That's part of the relationship. But this, of course, is precisely what the authoritarian society does not want and cannot tolerate. Every caste or class system demands that each person identify totally and only with the one role assigned to them in the tribal game. To know who you are, to know your place, to take the game seriously, to worry genuinely about one's movements on the checkerboard, to have the proper emotional, glandular responses to each game victory or game defeat. These are everywhere, virtues beyond virtue itself. They are the definition of sanity. The mystic who stands aside laughing is a threat to the whole hallucination. How many times have I been asked if this war can be stopped? Gurdjieff mused aloud in 1917. Of course it can be stopped. All that is necessary is for the sleeping men to wake up. Then they will stop shooting at each other and come home. In the same way, Carlyle wrote, "The widow is gathering nettles for her children. Far off, a perfumed singer lounges in a salon, and he hath an alchemy by which he takes every 10th nettle from her. He calls it rent." It is easy enough for the widows and orphans to keep that unearned increment of rent stolen by the seigneur. All they have to do is wake up and stop paying. Rent strike. You got Wilson, 1974, calling for rent strikes. And he was big on that. That was part of his Operation Mindfuck campaign, was to came up with creative acronyms of basically all centered around mostly to stop paying rent. He was big on that in the early 60s and into the 70s. So all they have to do is to wake up and stop paying. They do not even need Henry George, who coined the term unearned increment, to nationalize the land for them. They merely need to wake up. Meditation on such simple facts as these explain why Lao Tzu wrote ironically, "Those who speak do not know, those who know do not speak." This silence has indeed been the traditional policy of the mystic and the magus, and it mostly still is. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, for instance, a leader of the much maligned and rather tantric wing of Hindu theology, is still conservative enough to warn his followers as late as August 1973, quote, "And once you know this awakening, you can go on behaving in your society as it requires, but you are not in it. You are just acting. You will have to use unreal faces because you live in an unreal world. Otherwise, the world will crush you and kill you. We have killed many real faces. We have crucified Jesus because he started behaving like a real man. The unreal society will not tolerate it. We poisoned Socrates because he started behaving like a real man. Behave as society requires. Do not create unnecessary troubles for yourself and others." Sri Rajneesh is one of the boldest men in India. Orthodox fanatics have often rioted and staged demonstrations to prevent him from speaking because of his use of tantric sex rituals, very similar to Crowley's. And yet, in this passage, he takes the same tone of pessimism, conformity, don't spook the herd, and tacit elitism that mystics have espoused throughout history. Those who are awake, according to this viewpoint, should carefully pretend to still be asleep, so as not to disturb the others and lead to a general panic. A few mystics down the ages, Jesus for one, several early Sufis, the divine Adam Weishaupt, and some others have rejected this passive posture. None ever rejected it more thoroughly and vehemently than Aleister Crowley. To understand this aspect of Crowley's life, the law of thelema, given to him by his holy guardian angel, Aiwass, in the book of the law, we must take a closer look at the neuropsychology of authority and of liberation. The word of the law is thelema, said Iwas in the Book of the Law. Crowley, of course, recognized at once the echo of Rabel's Abbey of Thelema in Gargantua and Pantagruel, a gentle anarchist commune in which class and caste did not exist. Each man and woman was an individual sovereign, and the only law inscribed over the gate was, "Do what thou wilt." The Book of the Law immediately goes on. Who calls us the Lemites will do no wrong if the word is deeply considered. For there are therein 3 grades, the hermit and the lover and the man of earth. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Elsewhere, the angel dictating this book offers further glosses on the pivotal message. Thou hast no right but to do thy will. Do that, and no other shall say nay. For pure will, unassuaged of purpose, delivered from lust of result, is every way perfect. Every number is infinite. Every man and woman is a star. Thou shalt bring the glory of the stars into the hearts of men. Invoke me under my stars. Love is the law, love under will. There is no law beyond. Do what thou wilt. If one looks deeply into the word thelema, one finds that in classical Greek it means will, but in pre-classical Greek it appeared to have meant something similar to a magical charm or an invocation, i.e., an act of magical power. We have here a philosophy not unlike that of the Sufis, and indeed an excellent gloss is provided by the former Secretary General of the Sufi order, Hazrat Inyat Khan, in his little book of illuminated wisdom, Cosmic Language. Will is not a power, but it is all the power there is. With what did God create the world? By will. Therefore, what is in us we call willpower, in reality is a God power. Our hands, with all their perfect mechanism, cannot support a glass of water if there is no willpower to support them. It is not the body which makes us stand upright. It is our willpower. Therefore, in reality, birds do not fly with their wings. They fly with willpower. Fishes do not swim with their body. They swim with their willpower. Now, coming to the question of what willpower is made of, in poetical words, willpower is love. In metaphysical terms, love is willpower. And if one says God is love, it really means God is will. When Crowley, an intrepid Kabbalist, approached the Book of the Law receptively in 1909, having rejected it when given to him in 1904, he first added up the numerological value, the numerological value of thelema, and found 93. This reconciliation, seeking other words of 93 value in Greek, a Kabbalistic method of exegesis, he quickly recognized agape, love, as another 93. This reconciliation of love is the law with do what thou wilt convinced him there was meaning behind the seeming contradictions and occasional coded and or incomprehensible passages of the Book of the Law. Hazrat Inyat Khan continues, also, will and consciousness are the same fundamentally. It is 2 expressions of one thing which make them distinct. This duality comes out of unity. It is God's own being that in expression is will, in response consciousness, In other words, in action it is will, in stillness it is consciousness. Just as fundamentally the sound and the sight are one and the same thing. In one condition, the friction of vibrations produces light. In another condition, the same vibrations are audible. In other words, just as we know one aspect of Niagara Falls through sight and another through sound, we know one aspect of ourselves through will and another through consciousness. We do not know our true will or our true mind in authoritarian society because we are trained from infancy to repress them both. The resultant of all these repressions acting convexly from outside is experienced concavely from inside as the defined self. It has been defined by others. The ego is a conspiracy by society for which you take the blame, said Mordecai the Fowl, high priest of Crowleyan magic in California, which was basically, that was Robert Anton Wilson. The I, which is seeking to escape the social trap, is that trap. Thus, in the axioms at the beginning of Magic and Theory and Practice, Master Therion writes, 6. Every man and woman is a star. That is to say, every human being is intrinsically an independent individual with his own proper character and proper motion. 8. A man whose conscious will is at odds with his true will is wasting his strength. He cannot hope to influence his environment efficiently. 9. A man who is doing his true will has the inertia of the universe to assist him. 12. A man who is ignorant of the nature of his own being and powers, even his idea of his limitations, is based on experience of the past, and every step in his progress extends his empire. There is therefore no reason to set theoretical limits to what he may be, or what he may do. Again, to repeat that, he wrote, there is therefore no reason to set theoretical limits to what he may be or what he may do. Hazrat Inyat Khan, still in cosmic language, quote, it is an optimistic attitude toward life which develops will. The pessimistic attitude reduces it, robs it of its great power. Therefore, if there is anything that hinders our progress in life, it is our own selves. There are two classic cases of trained impotence. Quote, conscious will at odds with true will, unquote, in very recent history. First, of course, is the incredible sexual miasma of the Victorians, in which it was widely believed that women did not and could not have orgasms, whereupon, as the psychiatrists of the late Victorian period discovered, a quite incredible number of women did not stop having orgasms. To some extent, the daughters and granddaughters of these energetically castrated women, among some today, are still impotent, although, as Masters and Johnsons have shown, very few cases have any physical cause, and almost all can be corrected in a few weeks of proper therapy. The second case of trained impotence in recent times is the withering away of ESP, quote, telepathy, during those decades in which, quote, all responsible scientists, unquote, claimed that there was no such thing. Ever since, statistical studies showed that some ESP decidedly exist, and scientific dogma has gradually retreated before real scientific curiosity. It has been easier and easier for magic students and others to unleash their own telepathic powers. These potent psychic talents were repressed, just like female sexuality in the Victorian age, by social prejudice. These are acute and specific instances of the general paralysis of will in authoritarian society. To say that caste or class exists is to say that repression exists. Freud and Marx were looking at the same problem without quite getting it into focus, either psychologically or sociologically. The defined society is mirrored in the divided self, and etymologically, repression, to push down, is the word best describing what is happening on all levels. The citizen is repressed as an infant, as a child, as an adolescent, as an adult, and the methods vary from the most brutal armed policeman to the most psychologically subtle pressure to conform. On all levels, fear is the force directing behavior. Again, on all levels, fear is the force directing behavior. And the wisdom lectures of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn told Crowley as early as 1898 that fear is failure and the forerunner of failure. He seems to have been the only Golden Dawn alumnus to have understood that aphorism fully. Oscar Wilde once remarked that disobedience was man's original virtue. And from a thelemic point of view, the original sin myth seems to have the facts precisely backwards. Obedience is best understood by observation of animal trainers, where the link between authority and submission can be observed most nakedly. Disobedience indicates the first appearance of manhood, of humanities, of a mind functioning above the reflex arc loved by behaviorists. Disobedience, will, and magic are synonyms for that disobedience, will, and magic are synonyms for that wholeness of which we are daily robbed by the divided society and divided self. You know what I'm saying? He's on some, fuck you, I won't do what you tell me. Orgasm and ecstasy. The sexual repression at the core of authoritarian society is no accident or coincidence. The most brilliant and radical of all meta-Freudian psychologists, Dr. Wilhelm Reich, has written extensively in The Invasion of Compulsive Sex Morality, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, and the Function of Orgasm, of human society evolved from the primitive libertarian matriarchy to civilized authoritarian patriarchy. He finds that, quote, psychological castration, unquote, or sexual repression is absolutely necessary to the production of vast, docile, submissive populations who will take orders from above. The purpose, he says, is the same as that served by gelding our stallions and bulls. The wildness is removed and primordial beast is tamed. So I guess gelding the stallions and bulls, what is that? Chopping the balls off. It's interesting. Well, Bob is smooth with words, but for someone who's usually so stark, he swerves around that, the gelding of stallions and bulls. Okay, so, but more especially in the function of the orgasm and the cancer biopathy, Dr. Reich has stressed the link between sexual repression, submissive personality, and, quote, muscular armor. The muscular armor is a chronic tension holding down, literally repressing biological feeling. In authoritarian society, the genuine biological impulse is not only against the law, but against the grain. It is often imperceptible. It then becomes almost an act of faith to continue to regard ourselves as living beings. The behaviorists who refuse to make that act of faith are content to regard us as complex machines. This philosophy of mechanism, Dr. Reich points out, is only possible to muscularly armored beings. A real single orgasm, involving the whole energy of the body, puts us in touch with cosmic life. The techniques of sex magic, so notoriously associated with Crowley, were not, of course, his own invention. They had been treasured for unknown centuries by the Ordo Templi Orientis and were also known to the medieval witches, Hindu and Buddhist tantrics, and many Sufis and alchemists. The technique is excellently described by Thomas Pynchon in his novel Gravity's Rainbow. The charm she recited then, fastening the silk crotch torn from her best underpants across the eyes of the doll, his eyes, was this: May he be blind now to all but me. May the burning sun of love shine in his eyes forever. May this, my own darkness, shelter him. By all the holy names of God, the angels Michael, Yael, Ainfiel, and the great Metatron, I conjure you, and all who are with you, to go and do my will. The secret is in the concentration. She inhibits everything else: the moon, the wind in the junipers, the wild dogs outranging in the middle of the night. She fixes on Tiknukrin's memory and his wayward eyes and lets it build, pacing her orgasm to the incantation, so that by the end, naming the last names of power, she's screaming, coming without help from her fingers, which are raised to the sky. The energy usually bound in tense muscles but released in true orgasm is called orgone by Dr. Reich and is said to permeate all space-time, both the organic and inorganic being aspects of it. The energy usually bound in tense muscles but released in true orgasm is called orgone by Dr. Reich and is said to permeate all space-time, both the organic and inorganic being aspects of it. Dr. Henri Puharich, neurologist, offers a similar theory in Beyond Telepathy, naming the force bioplasm and connecting it with psychokinesis, poltergeists, and similar magic happenings. Similarly, it is prana to the Hindu, Tao to the Chinese, mana to the Polynesian, Wakan to the Plains Indian, Orendo to the Iroquois, animal magnetism to Mesmer, Odal to Baron Rickenbach, psionic force to Russian parapsychologists. When directed by will, it seemingly can do everything except violate the laws of its own nature, although these laws are more flexible than the incurious and uninvestigative imagine them. Some magic orgasm is always ecstatic in the etymological sense. One is outside one's usual self-image, as in the exercise of assuming the form of God. The usual self-image, indeed, while basically an act of imaginative identification, is also the internal sense of the muscular armors described by Reich. That this magical art was so murderously persecuted by the Holy Inquisition, 9 million dead, some estimates say, may be only partially attributed to Christian bigotry. The fact that authoritarian society cannot afford to tolerate people without a restricted, limited, specific self-identification as a player in a social game. Timothy Leary, Ph.D., in a neglected but tremendously important paper, How to Change Behavior, has defined the fashionable game concept of human behavior more tightly than Bern, von Neumann, Morgenstein, Wertheiser, Heidegger, and other game theorists. A game, in Dr. Leary's sense, comprises 1. Roles, 2. Rules, 3. Rituals, 4. Language, 5. Goals, 6. Characteristic space-time locations, 7. Characteristic space-time movements. The popular alcoholic or heroin addict games, for instance, have 3 pivotal roles of addict victim, angry persecutor, and sympathetic rescuer, as Eric Byrne, MD, has pointed out. The rules are equally rigid and include visits to jails, after meeting certain persecutors, visits to hospitals after meeting certain rescuers. The rituals are intricate, as can be observed at any bar or any place heroin junkies assemble. The language carries a great burden of unacknowledged metaphysics in which unimagined identifications are projected promiscuously upon the world and taken for reality. The goals are guilty except for the authoritarian games otherwise enforce and masochistic punishment for that escape. The typical locations and movements grow so stereotyped that one can find the players within half an hour in any large city, and they will be in the same environs, doing the same routines as in any other large city. In the interpersonal diagnosis of personality, Dr. Leary has classified typical game transactions on a grid showing how the various authoritarian games relate to each other. A person whose game involved transactions in any quadrant easily finds others in the reciprocal quadrants to, quote, play with them. For instance, the masochistic and submissive will function far out near the perimeter of quadrant 5HL. Easily draw in the autocratic types who function near the perimeter of quadrant 1AP. This is the typical master-slave position, sacralized in the typical way of doing business in authoritarian cultures, played more earnestly and violently by the docile slaves who advertise for masters to discipline them in the personal sections of sleazy newspapers. The army is the murderous ultimate in this game. Muscular armoring, in which all the genuine biological drives are repressed, is the price we pay for maintaining the authoritarian structure of these games. Sexual repression, allowing for some pleasure occasionally, but atrophying the ecstasy function, maintains the superficial ego needed to entertain the game and confuse it with real life. It is hard to believe that most people spend almost all their lives monotonously playing the same games, i.e., restricting themselves only to the interpersonal transactions of one narrow quadrant of the Leary graph. Strange as this is, it is true, as all clinical psychology bears witness. The man who arrives late and apologizes for it will soon exhibit other clumsy or maladaptive behavior and will apologize for that, and so on, through all... Oh, look at this. Okay. Through all this interpersonal relatings, the oaf who criticizes your first transaction will soon criticize another, then another, and so forth. If you do not cooperate by being properly guilty and submissive, he will give you up as a bad case and go on, until he finds his natural playmate in the first man mentioned above. It seems hard to believe still that a man whose games call for him to have... So, touching on that real quick, that's interesting, isn't it? That's having lived in several parts of the East, Midwest, and Far West. Only one time in my life did I actually see a private detective agency advertising, quote, armed rent collectors. It was on 110th Street in New York City, Harlem. Nonetheless, the supposedly free citizens of this allegedly democratic nation go on paying their monthly tribute to the lords of the land, or landlords, just as if Freudian... got it. Nonetheless, the supposedly free citizens of this allegedly democratic nation go on paying their monthly tribute to the lords of the land, or landlords, just as if feudalism still survived, as indeed it does. Benjamin R. Tucker defined rent as the tribute paid by the non-owning user of land to the non-using owner. Yet most people accept this medieval exploitation as if there had never been an age of reason. They only accept a medieval censorship system for TV and radio, and only a slightly less medieval control over drama, movies, books, and records. The authoritarian split between master class and servile class has survived the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, the 14th and 15th Amendments, the 20th Amendment, women's liberation, and even the LSD revolution. It is by far our most popular interpersonal game and the foundation under all other games.